you guys to start out by asking, like, what were some of the most common questions that you all saw in your secondaries, and how did you go about like breaking them down, especially the things that kept like repeating themselves over and over again? Anyone want to go first?
That's me. So I feel like some of the really common ones are why the school? Very popular questions. Some of them can be essay length and some just ask for a few characters. Other common ones are a challenge, like a proud moment, any sort of kind of a question that kind of looks at your reasoning and your ability to overcome stressors. There'll be questions about ways in which you relax and deal with stress specifically. I've noticed very specific questions that'll ask about your research and your volunteer experience and ask you to expand on the one that is most significant to you, which is very similar to a primary question that you'll see. And then there's the wild card questions. There's schools that really just want to see your creative side, see your hobbies, see what you love, and will ask really fun questions depending on how you look at it. So they're all across the board, but there are tons of repeats. Like, you know, you'll notice that even if there's a little bit of a difference, they're very similar at their core. So even though it feels like there's hundreds of questions, I myself made a full document of all my secondary questions, and the Google Doc was like 90 pages long, but a lot of it was repeats. So I find that kind of organizing it and noticing the trends really helps you overcome the immense stress that comes with suddenly having 20 secondaries that you have to do in the next like couple of weeks.
I think Megan really covered like a good breadth of like what these questions might look like. Something that helped me is that I think every question, well, not every question, but almost every question should involve, you know, something about yourself, you know, perhaps an anecdote that you can pull from one of your experiences, something that you envision for your future. So it definitely has to be about yourself, even if it's one of those fun prompts. And even if it's not a why this school prompt, it should talk about your fit, like why you would be a good fit for the school and why that school is a good fit for you. And if you can try to incorporate both of those aspects into every essay you write, you'll end up with a really strong application.
I definitely agree with all of that. I will say for scheduling, because you probably already have gotten dozens of secondaries at this point. I tried to break them up into like chunks. And so schools that had similar prompts, I tried to submit in like the same like day or something. Like I like knocked those out. And schools that had more tedious secondaries, I tried to sort of work on a little bit over the week or so and like slowly hammered away at that. And so you want to be strategic about like not doubling your efforts for like things that repeat, like everyone said already. And I think with timing, like you want to be strategic with that as well. So some secondaries will have early deadlines. And so you want to get those out pretty quickly, and certain secondaries will give you a little bit more time. And so you can be like a little bit more creative about things that you write about, I think. Yeah. Oh, we lost Reza. Oh, no. Okay. Do you guys have any tips for brainstorming topics that were perhaps difficult? Like, did you talk with a friend or a family member? Were there certain things that you were like, I literally don't know how to answer this?
I don't know our audience, so I don't know where everybody is in the cycle or if everybody is in the cycle right now. For those of you who are yet to be in the cycle, this is a really great question, because I remember struggling with it, but something that helped me is I maintained a journal of like different experiences. Anytime I had something that I thought was like a cool medical or clinical experience, or just like a moving experience or something that I thought was like a turning point for me, I would try to write a little bit about it. So I had that to lean on while I was drafting my secondaries. So if I've caught you early enough, maybe that's something that you can start.
I absolutely love the foresight that you had. Like, I'm so impressed. I wish that I didn't even think about anything like that, but that would make it so much easier when going through these questions. So 100% recommend it. I personally didn't do anything like that. I kind of was trying to figure it out on the spot, but I just found that talking to people around me who had been with me through all of college, particularly like my roommates and friends, could kind of help me with the brainstorming process. Other people and organizations I was in. One question that I found hard to answer was the challenge question. I didn't know how I wanted to approach that because, again, I wanted to pick something big enough where you could see aspects of my journey in the challenge. Because you can pick small challenges, and I know people have done that and shown how much they've grown from the smaller challenges. But I ended up choosing something that spoke to my journey from high school through into college. And it was very helpful to talk to friends that were there throughout that process, to kind of figure out what my feelings were, figure out how I wanted to write this story, because that can be a prompt that you get quite a few characters for. So it was definitely something that I wanted to work really hard on.
Dovetailing into that, so someone was asking from the RSVP form, is it okay to talk about things from high school? What are your thoughts about that? Would you recommend that? Would you not recommend that?
I can take this one. This is my take on it. There's no categorical answer. It's not like a yes or a no. If it was an experience that really spoke to you, it was a big turning point in your journey, feel free to include it. I see no reason why you shouldn't. But also, like, be a little bit critical and ask yourself, if the best answer that I have is coming from my high school days, is that going to look like a hole in my journey? Meaning, like, why can't I show more progress on this in the more recent years? But obviously, like, some of us have experiences from high school that like motivated us to study medicine or to want to study medicine in the first place. Like, that's totally fine to include. And I definitely wrote about, like Megan, I wrote about like a challenge sort of throughout childhood, and then through high school and into college, and sort of showed that full trajectory for my essay as well. And I think that that's totally fine.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, I completely agree. I think if there's like a theme that has sort of stuck with you since high school and you've been continuing that project or something, I think it's organic to say that, I've been doing that for so many years. And I think that shows interest. But you also don't want to like just silo yourself and just talk about something that happened in high school that you didn't really continue throughout college or post college. I think it sends a little bit of a red flag. So I definitely agree. Another question I have for you guys, and I think I touched on this a little bit already, but how did you prioritize your secondaries? Because it is a lot of stuff. It's really stressful. It's time sensitive. So how did you keep track of everything?
I know I mentioned that at a Google Doc with all of my questions, but I also had a Google Sheet with all of the dates that I received the secondaries, and then the dates I would like send them out, just to kind of keep track of everything. But I would also put like a goal date in that was like no further than like 1 to 2 weeks past. I decided whether it was 1 or 2 weeks based off how important that school was to me. Not to say that all schools are incredible and every school is an opportunity, of course, but I'm a Californian and I desperately wanted to stay in California for medical school. So anytime I got a secondary from any school in California, my goal was to have a turnaround time of like 2 to 3 days because I wanted to hear back from them sooner. And so they were hearing back from me sooner. So I think you really look at your priorities as well when it comes to creating those dates. And of course, try and get things back at a reasonable pace. So like, even if it's not your favorite school, still try to get it back within 2 weeks. But if location is important to you, if there's something about a program that really draws you in, you really want to go to that city, you love their mission, I think using those things to kind of create a list for yourself personally really helps. And as far as that tracker, I continue to use it through like getting interview invites and like when I went and like when I heard back. So I had like a full color coded thing, but that's not to say you have to do that. It's just helpful.
I had one of those trackers too. I love my spreadsheets. It's just very like comforting to have a color-coded spreadsheet for me. But I also did sort of what Manisha did, which is to group by prompt. And if there was a school that I saw that like, oh, I already have pre-written essays or essays that I've written for other schools and already submitted that will fill all these prompts, those schools would go out way faster. And then things that I had to sit down and write, I would sort of set those aside and then work on them in like a dedicated way on a different day or something like that.
Um, oh, no, Reza, go for it.
Okay, sorry, y'all. Okay, so we had the admissions board of our state medical school come to our school to talk about this very subject, and they said that they look at how fast you respond to their essays. They actually look for that stuff when they read applications, because the faster you reply, it shows that you like that school more and you prioritize them more than other schools. I know it's not an answer that many of you are looking for, but they said that. So I just wanted to make sure you hear that, because I also made sure I did what Megan told y'all. If a school was very like on my top priority, I would make sure to respond to them within a week when I got second.
That being said, though,
Yeah.
so this is a tangent, but UCLA was the last school that I submitted a secondary for, and I submitted it like a month after I had received it, and like I am here. So, you know, I just, you want to be mindful of the timelines, but also you don't want to be like chained to them. Like, you know, if you need like an extra week to like breathe and like, you know, maintain your sanity, like do what you have to do. I will say, like Teresa's point, if you know that this is a school that has like rolling admissions, you want to submit that secondary like literally like less than a week ASAP, because the faster you get that in, the faster you get your foot in the door for an interview potentially. But schools like UCLA, like, can maybe get away with submitting it like a little bit on the later end and you will probably be okay. So do your digging, ask your friends, ask your advisors at school, and just make sure you rank your schools based on like how fast things need to be turned in. It's all about balance.
Someone asked, is 2 weeks too late? And like, I've actually heard that like 2 weeks is sort of the target. I used that as like my target. I tried to get things in within 2 weeks and stuff. So yeah, 2 weeks I don't think is too bad, but just to specifically answer the question that was in the Q&A.
Also, what I noticed was a lot of the prompts were repeated in many schools. So what I did before I even started getting my first secondaries, I went ahead and used my free time to answer to a lot of the prompts. So when I got the secondaries, I could just copy and paste my answer for a lot of the questions that were kind of similar between the schools. So if you have free time now and you haven't gotten secondaries, you can go ahead and answer them so that when the secondaries come in, you kind of have your answer ready. You can just tweak it a little bit for the schools. But yeah, the 2 week, I know one of you said that you're working full time. I mean, I'm pretty sure schools know that a lot of the students have a lot of things going on. So don't worry about it that much, but try to prioritize the schools that you really want to go to, as Manisha was talking about.
But I just wanted to add to the working full-time thing, because I was doing all of this while working full-time. And I will say it is a little bit stressful, but if you study for MCAT during like full-time work or anything else, this is about equivalent to that. That whole month, I just like set aside time every single day to work on secondary. So my social life was not the best, but I try to really pack it in. So like I got them all pretty much done within a month. So I only did secondaries for the month of July and then they were done. So I think, you know, if you were able to, like I used to get home around like 6:30, I'd eat dinner, and then from dinner to bed, I would work on secondaries. So not a lot of other stuff were happening, but I think it is doable if you're able to, but I wouldn't worry too much. Everyone does understand. And a lot of us have been through this.
And if your circumstances are like especially extreme, you can reach out to the admissions team and see if they like will grant any sort of extensions or things like that. If your circumstances are really that complex and unique to you, I would use that sparingly, but that is an option.
I will say I have a friend And she did phenomenally in her like application season, and she was sending in secondaries in October. I like absolutely do not recommend this, but like I have heard like stories of like exceptional candidates being okay throughout this process, but I would say the most of us are like pretty average, and so I would just stick to the like normal path of submitting as soon as you can. 2 weeks is pretty good. So I want to just transition into the next set of topics, which have to do with proofreading and feedback. So did you all have other people proofreading your essays? Who did you get feedback from, and how did you know it was ready to submit, basically?
Yeah, so I definitely had a bunch of people reviewing my secondaries. I definitely got some feedback from my pre-med advisor at my school, but I didn't really get that much like professional feedback on a lot of my secondaries. Like definitely he helped me on a couple of the core essays that I knew that I'd be reusing over and over again. But really, like when it came down to it, it was mostly like people who knew me well, as opposed to people who were like professionally in the medical area. I know that people like to send things to like their trusted professors or mentors and stuff, and I really didn't do that very much. I found that it was a lot more helpful to send it to people who knew me well and also were good writers who could like help me with some of my poor word choice, or my, if my grammar was here or there, they could catch things like that too. And then since they knew me well, they'd be able to sort of comment on whether I was speaking authentically, or maybe even suggest if I had like a better topic to write on.
Yeah, I would say so what I ended up doing was I submitted my like primary in June and got my secondaries in July. So I spent like that like in between buffer time between June and July, just nailing down the essays that I saw coming up over and over again. So like the adversity essay, like what would you contribute to the school essay, like things like that. And I workshopped those pieces to death with like my close friends, and there was like a writing center through my work. So I spent like 2 or 3 weeks just nailing that down. The rest I just wrote on the fly, like did a quick like spell check, made sure I got the school name right. And I was like, here we go, like copy, paste, send it in. And so that's what I did to just be like quick about it and be strategic about it, so that the things that I saw mattered, I made sure to like do those well. And the rest I was like it wasn't bad writing, but it also wasn't like the world's best writing either.
I also did exactly what Manisha did. During those 2-3 weeks before I got the secondaries, I focused on those essays that were like the topics that kept like coming up. But also, as she said, like before, I would submit my secondary so fast sometimes, like within 1 to 2 days of getting them, because I just wanted some schools like too much. And for those schools, I just made sure that I answered the question authentically. And I think for secondaries, the content of your answer matters more than maybe your word choices and your grammar. I mean, obviously you shouldn't like make mistakes like that, but I think the content is way more important for secondaries, because they're actually asking those questions, trying to get something out of you, and they want to actually know like more about you by asking those questions. So
There's one question in the chat that I think maybe we can talk about. It's about the sort of adversity or challenge essay and how we tackled that. And so this person's saying that they feel like they don't have something to talk about. I will say that the whole point of this essay is to show growth. So you want to show, one, you want to show growth, and two, you want to translate that and say like, this is how I've grown. I'm going to experience a lot of crazy stuff in med school, and this is how I'm going to apply what I learned in med school. And so those are the two things that you want to write about. And so you can write about literally anything. I was working in a lab. I think I wrote about the fact that I had like an experiment that had failed for 2 straight months, and I was like ready to like rip my hair out. And so that was an experience that I talked about, and I talked about failure and like you know, even though it ultimately never worked in the end, I think, you know, the skills of like resilience and perseverance and sort of managing expectations are like all transferable skills in med school. And so it's not particularly original, but, you know, it is an honest and true answer, and like it applies to what we do every day. So that's what I did. I don't know if you guys have anything that you want to share.
I answered this question in like one of two ways, depending on the nuance of the question, and like what kind of maybe experience they were looking at. One way that I answered it was like looking at like a nonprofit organization I was a part of and a challenge that we had in the way our services changed and kind of approaching how our group found new purpose in the clinic that we worked at. And kind of showed my growth in like collective reasoning and, you know, weighing all these different options. And then could also show that I was very involved in this organization and that it meant very much to me. Showed my leadership skills, things like that. And then the other way that I approached it, as I said earlier, was kind of talking about how I went to this like very conservative high school, and how that initially shaped me, and how through the process of like going to Berkeley and like, you know, how I explored all these interests and perspectives that I wasn't able to see when I was younger, and how I wanted to continue that journey in medical school and continue to explore all these different perspectives from that specific growing up lens that I had. So one was a lot broader and spoke more to me as a whole person, versus one was more narrow and spoke to an individual challenge that I had.
I always find that when I'm struggling to brainstorm for an essay, I try to reframe the prompt in a way that does make sense to me. So if you said that you're struggling to find an adversity to talk about, you know, something that I struggled with in the adversity essay is I sometimes felt like my adversity might not have been big enough or something like that. And it's a good thing to remind yourself that it's not the adversity Olympics. It's like Manisha said, it's about growth. So I tried to reframe it like this. The real question that the adversity essay is asking is, how do you cope with stress? And what are, like, how do you perform under stress? So how do you cope with stress and how do you perform under stress? They're two separate things. And if you can find an example that speaks to that, even if it's not like a great challenge that you might think is worthy enough to talk about, that's still going to be a good candidate for this essay. And that goes for a lot of different essays, including like the diversity essay. You can reframe it in a way that makes sense to you, things like that. That's how I dealt with not being able to know like what to write about or like what to brainstorm about. Also, this is something that I said in a previous Med Mentors, but if you weren't there, this is just a personal opinion, but it's something that I think is important, so I'm going to share. I personally think that the adversity essay is different than a failure essay. You be careful about what the prompt is asking. If the prompt is asking about a time you failed, it is not necessarily the same as like when you met a challenge. You really have to make sure that you're addressing a time where you had agency and you messed up, that you as an actor, you failed. You can't just talk about a time that like something was difficult and frame that as something that you failed. I think that they're really looking for a time that like you played a role in the failure and then talk about what you learned from that. I think that's like a subtle thing that I don't think gets talked about very often, that people mess up. So just be careful like what the prompt is.
Another question that we had in this proofreading and feedback section, which I think I had difficulty with, was what happens in your writing where you're giving your work to someone, they have a lot of negative feedback. Like, how do you cope with that? How do you know whether or not to submit it, or, you know, if you should change it completely at the risk of sort of losing your own voice in the process?
So absolutely do not ever change an essay if you feel like your voice is not being represented in that essay. This is your time to shine and you have put in the work to get to this point, and like you have more than enough skills and resources and experiences to put yourself on paper and get into a good med school. So don't change an essay if you think that it doesn't authentically represent you. Something that I found is helpful, and like I review essays, and what I try to do when I'm reviewing somebody else's essays is establish some guidelines beforehand. The person who's writing the essay should be clear about the kind of feedback that they're looking for, whether they want, major content changes, or whether they want small nitty-gritty like word choice, grammar, kind of fine-tooth comb changes. They should be clear about, this is an essay that I'm happy with and I want to submit it. Can you just take a look through? Or this is an essay that I'm willing to workshop. Do you mind like giving me your honest feedback about it, or something like that? If you establish that at the beginning, hopefully you won't run into this situation. But if you do, this is still your essay. You should not be changing it for anybody if you think that it's not representative of what you want.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I made the mistake, I think, with like one person I remember giving an essay to, and they ripped it apart. And I remember like feeling really terrible about it. And then I started to doubt all the other work that I had submitted. And what I think, if you did what I did and you messed up, then I recommend just closing everything and taking a day off and like not looking at anything, and then come back to it after a day. If you feel like this is the work that you want to submit and you feel good about it, then submit it. So that's what I would recommend. But I completely agree. State your boundaries ahead of time so that you don't run into this problem in the future. Yeah. Yes.
I just wanted to add one thing to kind of echo what Amelia said before about being true to yourself and like keeping that in mind with every essay, is that even if it's not one person giving a huge amount of feedback, when you get lots of separate feedback, sometimes that too can change an essay and the meaning of it. So I would say after every edit and each person that gives you feedback and you accept it, just check in with yourself to see that that was the essay that you had intended, because you can end up so far away from where you initially started without even realizing it in just like a day or two. So I would just say, before you submit anything, give it one more read through, see if that's exactly what you wanted to say, because it's okay to change it back to what you initially had. If that speaks most truly to what you wanted to get across, just go back to that first version. It's completely fine.
Cool. Well, it is 7:30 and we've kind of gone through all of our proofreading and feedback essays. So I guess we can answer any questions that you guys have in the Q&A, and we can continue answering questions from the RSVP form. So I guess we have another question in the Q&A. I guess we kind of touched a little bit on this, but do you all have any advice or guidance for the diversity essay?
So for the diversity essay, once again, I reframed this prompt and tried to ask, what does the admissions committee really want from me from this essay? And the way that I arrived at the answer was, the diversity essay is actually asking what allows you to reach a patient population that other people can't, or what makes you uniquely suited to reach a certain patient population. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you have to come from a diverse background, but it's asking for your experience talking and commenting on the importance of diversity in medicine. So like I'm an overrepresented minority in medicine. I have a lot of friends who are overrepresented minorities, and we all struggled to sort of formulate our answer to this, because while we might have experiences that as minorities, it was sort of strange to be like, we are overrepresented in medicine. That doesn't necessarily correlate, but it's not about that at all. It's about what experiences can I comment on that I've had that will help me to reach a certain patient population that maybe others might not have had that experience.
Similar to reaching to the same patient population or to different patient populations, I kind of saw the diversity question as, what do you bring to our school that other students can bring? And not necessarily for the patient population, but in general, like as a student body, right? What do you bring that other students might not bring? Whether that's art, for example, my sister talked about her essay, like she focused on like her love for art and painting, and that was something that she decided to include on her essay because she thought that that's something unique that not a lot of dental students for her purposes would bring to her school. So what is something that you can bring to the school that other people might not be bringing?
Yeah, I would say I think the best essays that sort of talk about this question are ones that are like really true and authentic, and you talk very honestly and openly about your experiences and what they meant to you. And I think when your voice shines through, and regardless of how you choose to approach the question, I think the reader will be like interested in learning more about you. And I think that's the most important thing that you can do, because you're essentially just distilling yourself down. With all these secondaries, you're kind of just distilling yourself down into a set of questions. And so the more honest and open you are, I think the better it is. And they'll want to get to know you better, and will invite you for an interview to learn more about your story. And so I think always be honest and truthful and open about the things that you write. Yeah. Let's see, what other questions do we have? I think this is a good question. How do you make sure you're answering the question? Some of them are so vague. I remember, I'm not going to name the school, but I think I remember like one school was like, how do you define scholarship or something like that? I don't remember what I think I actually know what school this was. And I just remember thinking like, what in the hell are you like what am I writing? And so I think when they're really vague, I think the best thing that you can do is ground them in your own personal experiences. And so I was like, I'm going to define what scholarship means to me, and then talk about and then I was like, I'm going to now ignore the prompt, and I'm just going to like talk about my own personal experiences, and then tack on a sentence in the end that's like scholarship, yay, and submitted that. So that's what I did. I don't know if you guys have any like specific examples that come to mind or any advice.
I think when they are vague, it's meant for you to explore different options. They are looking to see your thought process and your creativity in those answers. At least that's how I took it. So I took it as a positive, not like they're trying to trick me, or they're looking for something specific. And I think it worked out for me in that, I would talk to other friends who are going through the process as well and see how they approached it in like vague terms. And I think, it's kind of a way to, if you need that direction, it'll give you that sense of direction to know what other people are doing. But I think you can also just really go for it. Whatever you think it means, I think is a valid way to approach the question.
For me, the broadness and the vagueness terrifies me. It really scared me. I didn't know if I was answering it correctly. The way that I got over that was I sort of put myself in the admissions committee shoes, and I was like, okay, what am I trying to get at with this question? If I were like trying to read a response, what would I want to see out of an applicant, and like how would I want them to respond? And that would help me reframe. I've talked a lot about reframing in this conversation, but I would always just reframe the prompt into something that made sense for me. So almost treating every prompt that was vague or broad as like as the prompt, which is like, what else should we know about you, or like what else would you like to add, so treating it like that and being like, what do I want them to get out of this prompt about me, and then tackle it that way. That narrowed it down enough for me to be able to say, all right, if I want them to understand that I'm passionate about advocacy, then I would be able to narrow whatever I was writing to talk about only that, even if the prompt itself was broad.
It can also help to think about what the other questions have asked in that secondary, if there's multiple questions, and find that one aspect that they haven't touched on yet and kind of fill it in, because they tend to all ask about the same 5 or 6 topics. And so you can just put that little bit in there that you've done a good essay on, and kind of take those qualities and add it to this question. So you present yourself in the best possible light.
Yep, I totally agree. So here is another question. So you obviously talk about your experiences in the primary application, like in your personal statement. You do it in like your like activities, significant experiences section. Now you're sort of doing it again in your secondaries. So how do you like avoid talking about the same thing 50 million times? Like how do you approach something from like a different angle, or how do you layer what you discuss?
One thing to remember is that the way that admissions works, the same people are probably not reading each of those different things. It often happens that someone reads your primary, someone else reads your secondary, someone else interviews you, and there's no knowing if they all read your entire application. So, definitely always give enough context to anything that you mention in any one question. Don't assume that they've already read something. So it's not repetitive, it's helpful for the most part. The other thing is that, secondaries give you a chance to, depending on the character length, of course, build that narrative again with some of those activities that you previously mentioned in just a few characters. Now you can kind of connect them to each other and show that larger growth, which, might not have been possible in your primary. So like overall, it's just another way to present yourself. And you can also add a lot of, smaller things in your life to your secondaries, like little fun facts or hobbies and things like that. There's like room for that in secondaries that you might have just mentioned in your primary. So I think most of the time it's a place for growth, unless it's like the UCLA secondary where, you have like a bunch of questions and you get super few characters, in which case it's completely fine to just repeat yourself. Like they're asking you to repeat yourself and that's okay.
I think with the repetitiveness, I try to be repetitive for some of the experiences that meant a lot to me. And even when I came for interviews, they asked me about those topics that I talked about in like 3 or 4 different questions. For example, like half of my personal statement was about this organization that I was a part of in undergrad. And then every kind of secondary that I got, I kind of tried to include that organization in every single secondary that I wrote. And when I went to interviews, that undergrad organization was always one of the topics that were brought up when they were talking to me. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be repetitive. You're just showing them how much you care about a certain thing. Yeah.
Yeah, the same thing happened to me. I was an EMT in college, and that's really like why I'm here at med school. So like, since that was such a formative thing, I like always went back to that one activity. I think that like in your personal statement and in your, especially in your work and activity section, you talk about your activities, you're talking sort of about what the activity like on the whole meant to you, and like how it generally affected, what you most broadly got out of it. I think your secondaries are a time where, depending on the prompt, of course, that you can pick certain events from those activities and talk very specifically about how like one experience during that activity affected you in one way, or maybe you learned one lesson from a very specific encounter. And that's a good way to sort of keep that, you're still referencing the same activity, so you're not deviating, from what you already submitted, but also give them something new and fresh.
I struggled with this a little bit on the research front, so I don't know if anyone here is applying to MD PhD programs, but you need to have like a research essay in addition to why MD PhD essay, in addition to like why med school for the primary, and then for the secondaries, in addition to the med school secondaries, you have to answer the research essay kind of again and like a couple of other questions. And so this was very difficult. I chose to highlight different things for different essays. So like for the research essay, for specific to each school, what I tried to do was demonstrate fit for the program. And so I would say like, this is what I've worked on. This is what I want to do in the future. So there's an element of forward thinking. I mentioned like faculty I'd want to work with at that school. So that's what I did there. There were certain things like in the YMD PhD, there's sometimes a YMD PhD essay, and I talked more about the integration of like science and medicine and like what that meant to me. So I was oftentimes like dancing around the same set of experiences, but like talking about very different key points. And so I think that's when it's good to have like a friend or a close mentor, just like look through your work and say like, I see the nuances between these different essays, and like, you're good to go. Because you don't want to like submit the same thing like 5 different times. So it's definitely a struggle. Another question that we got, I think more trends to like the beginning of the process. So how did you motivate yourself to start writing? And like, did things feel easier as they got along? Or how did you sort of go through the secondary journey emotionally?
It was really tough. It doesn't get easier, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. And when you're done, you're done. And being done feels really good. But no, it doesn't get easier. It just kind of sucks. You just keep writing. I don't have a very good answer to this. I think I tried to group up with a couple of friends who were writing secondaries as well. And we all sort of checked in on each other, made sure that we were drinking water, getting enough sleep. Basic, some self-care stuff, but other than that, you sit down and you got to write. You know, you're going to get into med school at the end of this, so the reward will be there.
I mean, I think I spoke to my tracker earlier, but honestly, the tracker motivated me just to turn things green, and see more and more of that list turning green was just one small victory a day. So, you know, if you're someone that likes that, I would do that. If you're someone that likes writing things down, just physically scratching it out, even that feels amazing. So, you know, you're just getting closer to your goal with each one that you do. And I personally found that they did get easier with time because, you know, some of the questions were repetitive, and I also saved some of the ones I wasn't so passionate about till the end, like the schools I wasn't so passionate about. So, you know, I just had a little bit less motivation towards the end to worry about how good a job I was doing. I was like, just get them out there. So, you know, it depends on your process, but towards the end of the month, I was like, it's not that bad. Like, you know, I'm almost done. It's fine.
Yeah, I would say for the first maybe 5 or 6 schools that I was writing secondaries, it was very difficult. And after that, it got a lot easier because even if the questions were not asking the same thing, I thought about like every different angle that they could have asked the question, so that I knew what I was gonna answer when I saw a question. So whether that meant just copy and pasting like parts of this question, parts of that question, and putting it all together, but by creating a Google Doc of like all the questions that I've been asked in the previous secondaries, when I got to more and more schools by the end, it wouldn't take me more than maybe like an hour for like an entire secondary for a school, because I already had the answers, or I knew exactly what I wanted the answer to be. So it got easier for me, I think.
I also just want to acknowledge that like it's totally okay to be feeling like really burnt out now. Like it's sort of, you know, you're like in this like bubble of writing applications while we're like living through a global pandemic right now. So, you know, it's hard to like find the energy to like, you know, pull things together and write secondaries. And so I think my advice, if you're feeling this way, is just to start with like the smallest possible task. Instead of saying, oh, I'm going to like write the UCLA secondary, be like, okay, I'm going to like try to answer one question. It doesn't need to be finished tonight, but I'm going to like try to do one thing. And so you do the one thing and you're like, okay, I did it. And you slowly build upon that. And, you know, it's okay. Like, do your best. I think schools these days have to be even more accommodating because, you know, they're delayed on their end too. And you're working as hard as you can, and you're probably, you know, still in school or like working a full-time job. And so, you know, I would say take your break days. If you feel like you need a break, take a break. I had my fair share of like, I'm going to get like ice cream at 11 o'clock at night because I need it. And like, there's like no shame in that. So practice your self-care. Do we have any other questions in the chat or things that you guys want us to answer? I guess I can ask all of you, is there anything that you wish you had done differently if you had to go through this process again? Would you change anything?
maybe this is hindsight speaking, but I've said multiple times there were schools that I wasn't super passionate about, and you shouldn't apply to schools that you aren't passionate about, but you're told to apply to a certain amount of schools, and I think at the point that the secondaries were coming in, the fact that I was putting them off and I wasn't doing them quickly, as Reza said, might have even shown to the schools that I wasn't as interested in them. So I think, through the secondary process, it became apparent to me that I could have done a slightly better job of choosing my schools. So that's something that, if you aren't in the process yet, really think about that, because, as people have asked, it's a super expensive thing to send in a secondary, like each one costs money. So think about if that application is worth the money that you're going to spend on it. That's the only thing that I look back on and think, oh, I could have done that a little bit differently. Other than that, it's once it's behind you, like that month, maybe month and a half of writing these essays, you'll forget about it, and the pain of it will slowly diminish over time, and you'll be a smiling med student in no time.
I think I made the mistake of applying to many schools, and what happened was, by the time I got my first interview, I still hadn't received secondaries from 20 of the schools I applied to. And I already got accepted to the school, to my state university, by the time I didn't even apply, but I didn't even write secondaries to 15 or something schools. So I ended up not even writing secondaries for like 15 schools, because they didn't mean anything to me at all. I just applied because I wanted to be safe. So I would totally agree with what Megan said. You should like think about, would you be willing to actually like put the money and effort to write a paper or like an essay for a school that you have no interest in?
Mine is a similar thing. I mean, I think I ran into a really similar problem. It just applied to a lot of schools. I talk a big game. I've got a lot of tips for y'all, but there were definitely secondaries that I submitted pretty late. And those were, again, the schools that, I might not have prioritized so high. So it sounds like we all ran into the same thing. If I can give you any piece of advice, I think, so we had this conversation at one of the secondaries Med Mentor Monday conversations like a couple weeks back. I'm super pro pre-writing. If you have the time and the energy, like months even before you submit your primary, if you know that you're going to be writing some of these secondaries, just start writing them like in that spring. You will thank yourself for it if you can get up that motivation.
100% agree.
Yes, pre-writing like saves your butt. It also makes it easier to get motivated because you're like, oh, I have a piece of this already written. I just need to spend an hour and can I think I busted out some secondaries in an hour. I was like, boom, 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 I'm done. I didn't apply to quite as many schools as Reza did, but there were some schools where in the end I had submitted the primary and I didn't want to submit the secondary. And I sort of justified that, like with the MD PhD programs, I can see who, like what students have gotten in and like where they've gone, what schools they've come from. And I'm like, oh, I do not fit this profile of students. So I'm not going to waste my time like writing a secondary and spending like the $150 or whatever. And so if I had done that work like ahead of time, I wouldn't have that extra stress on the back end. Yeah, so I completely agree with you guys. So we have like 9 minutes remaining. Do you guys have any parting words for everyone or general thoughts that we haven't touched upon that you'd like to share?
One of the best pieces of advice that I got when I was writing, so I'm not the best writer. I do my best. I'm a lot better at editing, so it's good when I can just get a rough draft out and like pretend like I didn't write it and then go back and edit it. But one of the best pieces of advice that I got was, don't get married to whatever you've written. It's all, it can change and it's allowed to change. And, even if you fall in love with, a phrase you've written because it sounds real pretty and you've got that great word choice, you're hitting some buzzwords, it might not fit in your ultimate, incarnation of your essay. And that is okay. So what I did, because I tend to fall in love with my phrases and get really stuck in the nitty gritty when I'm supposed to be focusing on content, is if I had a phrase I liked, I like cut it and pasted it into a different Word document and minimized that Word document. And I could always go back and take a look at those beautiful phrases, maybe even reintroduce them back if they did fit. But that way I didn't get too bogged down in the nitty gritty when I was really just supposed to be getting some content on a paper. A very oddly specific tip, but it really, it really helped me. So hopefully it helps you.
Yeah. Oh, Megan, go for it.
I was just going to speak to something similar, which is word counts and character counts. I know you've all already been through that with the primary application. There's so many things that have to be cut and sliced and finagled to fit into the word count. But I found with secondaries, it was really challenging because the same question that you would answer in 300 words would be like, okay, now we got to cut it down. And so you would keep cutting it and for different prompts. And so what really helped me, and I don't know if this will help you, is to remember my core message and get it down to like 1 to 2 sentences, because there is no prompt that will be smaller than 1 to 2 sentences. And then remember what that is and, build from there rather than cutting every time. I would just take sentences and add it to the 1 to 2 core messages as the characters allowed, because when you start cutting, like Emily already said, it's a painful process and cutting is hard. So I think building is sometimes better.
I think that's such good advice. I just have to say, like, just try to avoid the cliches. It's okay to write about cliched topics in like a fresh way, but like, don't write in a cliche, like don't use the word like symbiosis or like synergy or like, I saw the blood like gushing from his gut, like, like just don't do that. I think simple prose that's like clean and crisp is like the best way to go. If you're like, wow, this sentence is like beautiful, the like imagery I've evoked here is like A+, it's probably trash. So don't do that. But that's the one piece of advice I can give you. And I can say this as someone who's reviewed a lot of essays. So that's my piece of advice. Reza, do you have anything you want to share?
I think I kind of like going back to what Megan and Amelia said about building up rather than, I realized as I was writing my secondaries, and then every time they asked me to cut down, I realized after cutting down, I haven't lost anything. So that tells you how much, extra fluff I was adding to my answers. But I think just write a lot, and then you're gonna realize that for every secondary, you're gonna have like few sentences to a paragraph max that you think is the most valuable part of that response. So it's not as that hard to cut down, but it's hard to write more stuff because after some point you're just adding things that you're not really, you just want to say it to hit the word limits. But cutting down is so much easier. At least it was for me.
It's okay to be under the word limit. I will say, like, you don't need to hit like 1,200 out of 1,200 characters. Brevity can be your friend. So yeah. So we have 4 minutes left. I just want to plug AEFI, which Megan actually was running, and now I help co-run along with Monica. And I'll post the like intake stuff in the chat here. But basically, we're like a group of med students who all volunteered to help read your essays. And so now that we're in secondary season, you're welcome to submit. I think our rule is 3 submissions. So this can be